my pleasure to introduce the first panelist, is the Right Honourable Arron Wood, who is the Deputy Lord Mayor for the City of Melbourne. Please join us. And then we have Professor Xuemei Bai from Australian National University, and Professor Michele Acuto from Melbourne University. So what we're going to discuss today is the challenges and opportunities of building a stronger interface between policy and urban science. The speakers are going to introduce and share their thoughts with you, talking 10 minutes each, possibly. And then we're going to have time for some questions, inter-panel discussion, and question with the audience. We thought initially that we wanted to keep this session as interactive as possible, and therefore we wanted to throw some general questions at the audience before they start talking so that you can start thinking about what you want to ask them. So questions like, do you think science is important for decision making? Is science being used in decision making in your city? What kind of science do we need in today's cities? And what are the best science policy practices, and what are the blind spots? So this is just to keep you thinking while the panelists start their speech. And, you know, with no further delay, as we're running out of time, Arron, please, the floor is yours.
Hello? Yep, excellent. Thank you for that warm round of applause, but I'm going to ask you to do it again, because what we want to do is that this Spring of Nature conference is, I think, the most important conference of the World City Summit. Let's be honest here, people. So what we want to do is just fire it right up. Thank you. We like to do that because everyone out in the hall there just having a quiet coffee is thinking something amazing is happening inside. We must get in there. So thank you very much for having me, and thanks again to Spring of Nature for bringing me out to Singapore, who I have huge admiration for. Their urban forest strategy in doubling the density of their city, and also at the same time doubling the coverage of their urban forest is something we all aspire to. Their 3D data tool, their city mapping tool, again, really sets the bar high for best use of technology and data in responding to city challenges. So it's a pleasure to be here on behalf of City of Melbourne. Mine's going to be a mix of sort of science in the city melded with the smart city conversation. And we certainly don't have all the answers. And I think we're probably a good snapshot of where a lot of cities are at, that we make good use of science to a point, but we're definitely not sort of hand in glove with our scientific community, in spite of the fact that we have 10 universities just in the central city of Melbourne. So for those of you who don't know, City of Melbourne is just the 38 square kilometres in the heart of the city, including the CBD. We're the fastest growing city in Australia, and we round out the top 10 fastest growing cities in the OECD, and the greater metro Melbourne is just ticking over to a population of 5 million people. So rapid growth brings huge opportunities, but also massive challenges that lots of cities around the world are facing. We're the most livable city 7 times in a row. So I never tire of saying that. But that's judged by The Economist magazine, and it's a great city ranking that we proudly support. However, when you look at the Sustainability Index, the Sustainable Cities ranking, Melbourne sits about 33 or 34. So that's primarily because of the dependence of Australia on brown coal. So what we want to do is we want to keep that livability up where it is, or at least in the sort of top 3, but then start to bring our sustainability ranking up as well. Because if you're not one of the most sustainable cities, then being one of the most livable cities is really a time-based term. It's really only a matter of time before you start to slip down the livability rankings if sustainability is not absolutely core business in everything that you do. We've been recognised as a global knowledge city. An Intelligent Cities award last year really looked at how we're using data across the city to inform policy. But apart from all of those accolades, there's still some real knowledge gaps. So I'm going to zone in on probably 2 or 3 case studies where we've seen science working really well, but then there are still some gaps in that knowledge. And really that's a call out then to the scientific community and to local government as to how we can fill those knowledge gaps, but how we can better clarify the questions that cities are asking, and also deploy that research much more quickly and have actionable research that can be implemented and then analysed with the city as a lab. So one of the enduring strengths of Melbourne is that we're curious all the time, we're asking questions all the time, we're constantly comparing ourselves to what other cities are doing, and not just cities in Australia, but our membership of the C40 Cities Network, of 100 Resilient Cities, of ICLEI, show that we have a real appetite to partner with just about any network that allows us to share data, to share case studies, and to share intelligence on those sorts of challenges that are facing us. So I'm just going to quickly walk through a lot of the things we're doing because I'm not going to go into detail because of the time available. We have talking tanks where we have a network of stormwater harvesting across the city that captures stormwater for use on our parks and gardens, but is also there for flood mitigation, and the technical sort of attribute to that is when a storm event comes in, it gathers data from the Bureau of Meteorology, and those tanks can be emptied to mitigate flash flooding. We've got City Lab, as I said, which is an area of physical space, but also an online space where our community can prototype and test new ideas. We've got an innovation district which takes in our 2 largest universities in RMIT and University of Melbourne, my old university, where we're really sort of testing the latest in inbuilt sensors, monitoring programs, autonomous vehicles and so on. We've got a city data centre which we've just prototyped during Knowledge Week, which is a 3D printed model, only of Swanston Street at the moment, which is the main city spine. But we overlay that then with digital data like our 3D development activity monitor that shows buildings that are under application, buildings that have been approved and buildings that are under construction, so we can start to get a visual of what our city might mean. But then you can actually fly down even further and take a augmented reality or virtual reality walk, I should say, through our Green Laneways program and get a handle on what those laneways will look like into the future as we green them even further. As I said, we've got 10 universities just in the central city, so we're a true university town, and we've got lots of different partnerships indeed with Melbourne School of Design and University of Melbourne, but all of our universities. We co-fund a professorial chair in resilience as part of the 100 Resilient Cities Network, and that's a 50-50 funding split between the City of Melbourne and the University of Melbourne. So all of those things are great. Now, what are some of the gaps that we have? We have science-based targets for our climate strategy, our zero net emissions strategy, and we were one of the first city governments to move to measurement of science-based or implementation of science-based targets for our carbon disclosure reporting, and we're working with C40 all the time in terms of using those as case studies for our 5-year emissions reduction plan. We wanted to show our leadership on climate policy by publicly committing to a science-based emission reduction target of 4.5% per year, and this level of emissions reduction is the one that's internationally recognised to keep our temperature rise between 1.5 and 2 degrees by 2050. Following on from initiation of that commitment to adopt the science-based targets, we're talking about the recently announced Edmonton Declaration. So this is a call to action. Many of you may have heard of it. It's the research communities to truly consider the role of science, technology and data in supporting their bold climate action plan. So it was launched in March 2018 at the city's IPCC conference in Edmonton, and we're really asking global mayors to sign the declaration and amplify the message that cities urgently need the tools and data to address climate change. So we're pretty lucky. We've got a councillor on our council, Dr. Cathy Oak, who is now Vice President of ICLEI. She's got a real push on the better use of research in cities, and it must be designed with cities so that the data is actionable and usable. As I said, we also fund the Resilient Cities Professorial Chair. So our first case study is the urban forest strategy. We, like Singapore, have a very ambitious urban forest strategy to double the forest canopy cover over the next 20 years from what is around about 22% to up over 40%. And absolutely that's about cooling our city by 4 degrees, because the urban heat island effect in our city is not just about the environment and the amenity of the city. It's got huge health impacts. So in the Black Saturday bushfires, about 176 lives were tragically lost, but in the 2 weeks leading up to those bushfires, over 370 lives were lost due to heat-related illness and stress, particularly in the very young or the very old or those with pre-existing conditions. So for us, the urban forest strategy, yes, it's about making the city look good, but it's absolutely our first defence against the urban heat island effect. And the other part of this too is it has a huge economic impact. We surveyed our retail businesses alone back in 2016 rather. There was a heat wave where we had a week over 40 degrees. They were losing close to $10 million a day in lost revenue because people don't want to come into the city and spend money when you've got weather like that. So economic impact, big health impact, definitely environmental impact, and even a social civil unrest impact in that what police assaults show in terms of police numbers is that as soon as the temperature climbs over 40 degrees, people start getting a little bit crazy. So for us, it's a very important thing to tackle. It's good that when I did my degree in forest science at the Melbourne University, my name was Arron Wood. In my year level, and I kid you not about this, there was a girl called Belinda Field, a guy called Rob Plant, there was Virginia Forrest and Ben Woodman. And now I work with my fellow councillor Kathy Oak, and the head of the urban forest was Ian Shears. So we're very big on the urban forest for us. So greening our city involves a lot of science. It involves the science of trees, and in fact we've brought citizen science into that, where a lot of our population now help us in monitoring the health of those trees. We've got the urban forest visual, where you can click on each individual tree. You can know the life expectancy of that tree, of the 77,000 trees that we manage, the species, and you can participate in a conversation about the sort of urban forest that you want to see into the future as well. So there's definitely an engagement tool there. We take that much further then, and we have our biannual BioBlitz. So this is about monitoring the biodiversity health of our city, and that then informs how we plant our parks and gardens and our streetscapes into the future. And what that showed us is that we are underdone in terms of understory. So it is about gathering the data, getting that into a usable form, flowing that through to policy, and then on-ground implementation is critical, but ongoing monitoring so that we're constantly adapting to what is a changing environment and changing climate conditions is something that we can all do together. So BioBlitz in 2016, 744 members of the public participated, 27 activities across the 24 hours, 447 different species of plants, animals and fungi. So it really is a critical sort of snapshot for us in time. We do a hollow blitz as well, because we know how important hollows are for us, and this is where one of the gaps have started to arise. Many old exotic trees such as elms and plane trees form hollows suitably sized for wildlife, but virtually nothing is known about the science about which birds successfully nest in these hollows in Australia. Plenty is known about native tree hollows, but not those hollows which are actually formed in exotic trees. So again, having that policy or that data basis to inform good policy is just not there. Today our urban forest is dominated by a range of 3 species, elms, plane trees and river red gums, and many of these trees have predicted life expectancy of less than 10 years. Going through the millennium drought, where we went close to running out of water, similar to Cape Town, what Cape Town is going through at the moment, and that's where the urban forest strategy came from, is that we're looking at losing 40% of our 77,000 street trees in the city. So again, the science of what species are going to survive into the future is extremely strong in partnership with our universities, and we literally trial those tree species in real world conditions. So one of the other summations about the use of science in cities and making it relevant is that wherever possible is trialling that science in real world conditions out there, in the sort of conditions that they'll be faced with is absolutely critical. So they're just a couple of snapshots on how science informs what we do, and just a few things that I've learnt over the journey. I actually chair the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute at the University of Melbourne, so I still have strong links to the research community, but I'm now in that position of implementing or deciding on policy and then hopefully seeing that through to implementation. So here's just a few learnings that I've identified. We need to clarify the gaps in knowledge together with researchers. So the questions need to be clarified with the people that will be on the ground implementing it and with the policy makers as well. Co-funding of professorial chairs in areas that may not be sort of prominent already, I think is a good move. And obviously the example with the chair in resilience has been a really partnership approach to linking research and real world application. Speeding up less than perfect research timelines, so deploying that research a little bit earlier in the life cycle, getting it out there and making sure it's actionable at the end of the research period, or preferably during the research period so that we're constantly learning throughout it. Real world research trials set up in real world conditions, again in partnership with policymakers and implementers, and obviously deploying that research much more rapidly would definitely suit the sort of timelines that we're looking at for implementation. But overall, science and data, we've got an open data policy where we release about 50 data sets a year, and we put it out there to the community at large to then come back to us with solutions, because I think one of the greatest mistakes that local government, well actually all levels of government make, is thinking that we have all the answers. So this has to be a partnership approach with the complexity, depth, breadth of problems that we're facing at the moment, and we absolutely welcome a much deeper partnership with the research community to drive fantastic outcomes for our cities into the future. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. Before I start, I would really like to thank the organizer for hosting this wonderful event. And I'm working on cities, so for me, there's nothing in the world that are more important, than the topic that we are discussing today. So I think coming back to the thesis we are given, what is the state of the art in urban science and how can cities put existing knowledge into solutions, sustainable solutions today. I was just thinking about, the challenge of trying to provide a sort of overview of urban science. I have a quick question. How many Web of Science paper that I mentioned in urban over the last decade, you think? Give me a number. How many do you think there are? Anybody? Thousands? Any other numbers? 1,000? Any other numbers? A bit more brave? So we did this account in April, actually, for a paper we are doing for nature sustainability. There was 163,000 papers, peer-reviewed papers, over the last decade alone, and it's only including, Web of Science peer-reviewed papers, and about 25,000 of them are about urban sustainability. So you can see this is really, really flourishing, blooming sort of community. So, any attempt, and this doesn't even include, all the books, the book chapters, and then all the great literature, so-called, that practitioners and other researchers are putting up there. So I should say any attempt to try to say, okay, here's the state of art, you're basically shooting your own foot. Whatever you say, there will be other communities coming up and saying, no, there are this more, and, many different things. But having said that, I would like to really emphasize 3 points here today. The first one is the increasing need and attempt towards a better integration of knowledge production, and in other words, which is a systems approach in building the urban science. And we know there are many different conceptual framework, different theories, different disciplinary approaches into studying cities, and they all have different communities behind them. But what is really needed is to have a more systematic approach, both in terms of research and urban practice. And this can go a bit abstract, but I'll try to give you two examples. One is, we're talking a lot about taking ecosystem approach in cities. And we have heard, the Melbourne project about bringing in, more forest into the city, and also, the building infrastructure for flood control and things like that. And if you look at in this sort of gray or, peer-reviewed literature, many of the attempts try to bring more vegetation into cities are branded as green, and anything that is trying to improve the urban water and things like that are branded as blue. And anything that is more traditional sort of infrastructure and engineering approach is dubbed as gray. But taking a systems approach would mean, not seeing this as blue, green, and gray and branding them as such, but more like seeing them as a kaleidoscope. So it's a mixture of all these things. And then if you're trying to integrate all this blue and green seriously into urban structure, then you have to really think about what are the opportunities, what are potentials, and what are the constraints and limitations, and whether these sort of projects are scalable at all. So they have to be put into that kind of reality, into the context, if we are really trying to promote this ecosystem approach in cities really seriously. And also taking ecosystem approach in the context of systems approach is much more than integrating nature into cities. It is really about seeing cities as a complex system that are human dominant and try to manage these cities as such. And I had a short article just came out last Thursday, in Nature, which is entitled Advanced Ecosystem Approach in Cities. So if you're interested in this topic, you can take a look at that one. Another example I would like to give is in climate mitigation and adaptation in cities. And we all know very often, both research and practice in cities, when we talk about climate change, they are approached in different ways. I mean, one is mitigation, one is adaptation, and decisions are made differently, and policymaking are very often made independently. But actually, in reality, lots of these well-intended policies that are made independently, they actually compound each other, and very often they contradict each other even. So what is important is try to really identify what are some of the trade-offs and what are the co-benefits that you can really seek out and find out the synergies and try to maximize them, which is really important. And also taking systems approach in climate change in cities is also about trying to put this climate change adaptation and mitigation into the context of the cities. For example, like if we look at developing country cities, we know that they are facing lots of different issues, and climate change is just one of the problems that they are facing. So you have to look at this in this sort of context rather than all the funding are just going to climate mitigation or climate adaptation. You cannot really ignore all the other issues cities are facing. So this is really leading me to my second point, which is the need for building up a better urban science in Global South. And this is really building on a paper that is coming up in Nature Sustainability next Monday. I think it's called The Urban South and the Predicament of Global Sustainability. And if you're interested, you can take a look. It will be open access for a month, thanks to Monica. So we talk about urbanization is one of the biggest social challenges of our time today. But if you look at it really carefully, it's actually urban challenges in the Global South. Because if you look at the population prediction alone, they say we will be having about 2.4, 2.3 billion people, more people added into the world. But 90% of all the population will be actually added into cities in developing countries. So the great urban challenge actually is the great urban challenge in the Global South. But this is very seldom explicitly spelled out in this way. And the challenges that are facing global cities in the Global South and Global North, they are very, very different. And we've tried to show statistically how different they are and why. And apparently we need a much better knowledge to understand these challenges in the Global South. But then if we look at the global knowledge production system, it's heavily, heavily dominated by the global north. So we did an interesting exercise, try to see what are some of the best cited papers in urban or urban sustainability area. And we had this really stunning result. Almost all of them, with the exception 1 or 2 papers, are led by people in the, authors in the global north. So you can see how, the global northern perspective are really actually dominating the discourse of urban science, and that also means the power to shape some of the policy initiatives and things like that. And they are all based in studies in the global north. And this is actually much, and there's another thing is that even studies that are focusing on the global south, they are again dominated by authors from the global north. And then if you are, any of you are working on, developing country cities, the unfortunate reality is that your paper is much less likely to be cited in the literature. It's about, I think if you're working in the global north, you are more than 2 times likely to be cited. We did this analysis in this particular paper. And the point I would like to highlight here is that this is much, much more than talking about, the power game or the just or fairness or not within the scientific community. Actually, this has a very strong practical and policy implications. Because the problems in global south and north are so different, if all our knowledge is based on the empirical and theoretical construction based on the global north, they cannot really readily applied in the cities in the global south, let alone try to guide the practice in the global south. So this is not really only about scientific community issue, but this has really strong sustainability implications. So that's the second point I would like to make. And then the last point I would like to make is that the need for scientists and stakeholders are really, really try to work together and try to co-design and co-produce this urban knowledge. We have noticed a shift over the past decade or so. We did a review paper last year. And there was a shift from, in the literature, try to understand the impact of rapid urbanization towards understanding the, underlying mechanism and processes that are actually shaping this kind of impact, and then further towards finding solutions. Now it's really people are trying to ask, what science or what ecology or sociology, urban sociology, can do for cities. So these are the, really the state of the art or front-running sort of cutting-edge kind of questions. And of course, there are, still many, many fundamental questions that needs to be asked and answered, try to understand the urban system. But there's also equally important demand to try to come up with solutions that are, really addressing the problems cities are facing, and the solutions needs to be really actionable. It needs to go one step away or ahead from purely academic sort of exercise. So when we're talking about this, co-production and co-design and co-production, which is sort of buzzword in today's sustainability community, we have to acknowledge there are challenges. We cannot really, too much just romanticize this word of co-production and, co-design, because to begin with, there are, different scale of consideration. For example, like at some point, a mayor told me, like, Xuemei, if you cannot give me an answer in 15 minutes, what I should be doing with my $10 million decision, then you're basically out of my scope. But for researchers, coming up with an answer in 10 minutes or 15 minutes, it's almost impossible. Usually you say, oh, let me go back and then let me do some literature review and do some analysis, and that will take 1 year to 3 or even 5 years. So basically, there is this very strong disconnection between science and policy, but we do need to bridge this in order to find solutions. And from academic point of view, we also need to probably build up, incentives beyond the traditional academic, incentives like, you publish peer-reviewed papers and things like that. But equally, we need to recognize those who are trying to engage with practitioners with the city and then try to come up with the real world solutions. So I will leave it there.
Thank you. Michele?
I'll stand as well. Thanks a million for the chance to share a few things. I think my role in the All-Australian panel, by the way, my role is reporting on a current initiative that Nature Sustainability has been leading on. It's an international expert panel. I'm one of the 3 co-chairs of that, along with my colleagues Karen Sito from Yale University and Susan Parnell from the University of Cape Town. And it's an international expert panel on science and the future of cities. So the brief or the task was to share a few ideas that are coming out of that effort. And I guess the rationale for doing that is pointing at a few things that sort of might or not be as obvious as we make them. So the International Expert Panel is a group, and Xuemei is one of the members, of 30 leading scholars. It's not nice to call yourself an expert, so let's say a variety of leading scholars on urban issues. We're talking all sorts of things, from engineering and digital expertise like Carlo Ratti at MIT, arts and humanities, Richard Sennett at the LSE and NYU, our colleague Arman Ravi at the Indian Institute of Human Settlements, and so forth. So that was born effectively, and you might or not know this, I'm always sort of fairly surprised by the lack of attention for a large United Nations process. But in fact, a number of people like Xuemei, like myself, like many others, around the establishment of the United Nations New Urban Agenda, and in fact around the establishment of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, had written quite a lot of advocacy pieces effectively in Nature, dare I say Science, I apologize for saying Science in a Springer event, but in leading academic outputs. And the advocacy pieces were effectively about the lack and poverty, to a degree, of the sort of science policy interface that Arron and Xuemei were talking about. The fact that for all the great grand promises of urbanization and the great grand promises of urban science and urban research, we are not doing a great job at connecting effectively science and policy. So the reason why I say that is not just to flag an initiative, but also to flag that science in itself is not just a provisioner of data. Science and urban research is also a form of advocacy, a form of making statements about the world, the urban world we live in. So what happened is that we sat down, we thought this was worthy of attention, even though the United Nations eventually decided not to go ahead with an intergovernmental panel on urban sustainability or on cities. We decided to take it on ourselves to try and gather a bit of the science and the state of affairs, shooting ourselves in the foot, like Xuemei suggested, in trying to condense the knowledge about cities, and in particular about the science policy interface about cities. Now the report of that panel comes out later in October this year at the UN World Data Forum. But a few things that sort of already are apparent and that have come out of conversations, interviews, discussions in London at the World Urban Forum, in Kuala Lumpur, and one-on-one with the various experts. And I think one of the things that I would like to start with is when you put 30 experts from really different disciplines in a room numerous times, one of the things you learn is, in fact, again, that science isn't just advocacy, is in fact also disagreement. That perhaps facetiously or not, you might need 2 Watsons, not 1 Watson, to do a proper scientific job, in the sense that it's almost impossible to get 30 experts, even from akin disciplines, to always agree on matters. And that's one of the great things of science, that there is capacity for revision and rethinking and criticizing and peer reviewing each other and so forth. Something else that clearly stands out for us is the gaps and imbalances of science. That even if we were to digitalize and AIize the research and processing of scientific data, the data available at the moment is fairly unbalanced. It's very unbalanced, for instance, in the sense that data about governance, participation, legislation in cities is almost entirely qualitative. Data about transport, education, and many others is almost entirely statistical. There's very limited GIS, geolocated data about legislation, and there's very limited qualitative appreciation of things like education in cities. So one of the problems that we see, for instance, is that the database is there. There are hundreds of thousands of papers and data sets available on cities, but they are fairly unbalanced on to what they cover and what do we know of what. So for instance, 43% of data globally in cities or in global data sets that cover cities covers Europe. Yet we know really well that the bulk of urbanization is happening in Africa and Asia. So one of the key questions is we probably know more than we need to know about certain areas of the world and not enough about areas we should really know fast lots about. Something else that clearly stood out for us and stands out for us is that, in fact, for all the talks about the global and the planetary reality of urbanization, we actually have very, very limited global appreciation of urban processes. We tend to have a lot of comparative data. There are today our colleague Greg Clark estimates in the range of 300 benchmarks and rankings of cities, but that's very specific comparative data. There's very limited globally oriented data sets. So the classic number that everyone just tells you at every single conference that has something on cities is more than half of the world's population lives in cities. But it's one of the few numbers we have at a global scale that can give us an appreciation of the global experience of urbanization. So for instance, we know that there are roughly 850, 860 million people living in urban settlements that are informal, but that's about it. We don't know trends, we don't know implications of that, so we need much more global urban science, not comparative or specific urban science. As Arron said, so I don't have to do that job again, fundamental for us is the question of science policy experiments and experimentation of sharing the burden of the urban planet between the policy and the academe, but in fact the research in general, not just academe, and one of the key things there being, in fact, research is not just produced by universities, and we shouldn't think of universities only. But experiments like, for instance, we do in Melbourne with the chair in Resilient Cities, are fundamental, not just because we're paying for a fantastic professor, Lars Koenen, who's doing a brilliant job, but in fact because they open a two-way window between City Hall and the university, where it isn't just Lars, it's Lars and PhD students, it's Lars and postdocs, it's a continuous going back, and it was one of the things that attracted me to Melbourne, a continuous engagement back and forth between the city and the university. If you take the 250 largest cities globally, the distance between City Hall and the closest university is 4 kilometers. That number, in average, goes up to 6 kilometers if you take the 400 largest cities globally. So, in a sense, in reality, there is a very limited distance to be bridged there, and yet is very often not bridged and not effectively experimented with. So one of the things that we're saying is, A, we need far more of these type of experiments, joint investments in a sense, and we need to learn from the South. Some of the best examples of this, for instance, the GCRO in Johannesburg, it's the City Region Observatory for Johannesburg. It's produced by the two largest universities in Johannesburg, the regional government and the local government. It provides really accurate data, even on extremely sensitive topics like mapping, geolocating homophobia in the region of Johannesburg. Is probably one of the best global examples of accurate, up-to-date, almost nearly real-time and yearly tracked trends that are policy relevant. So we need much more of those, and we need not to be afraid of going south to learn to do things north, eastwards, and so forth. And one of the things that this is fundamental for us is it's effectively just a question of creating greater scientific literacy in city leadership, in encouraging city leadership to be available to just ask the questions. Very often we've learned it's not just a matter of cities asking for new data, and that happens all the time, commissioning new data sets. But in fact, it's just a question of asking whether a data set exists. That is the key matter there. And to wrap it up on something that, again, seems obvious until we don't grasp the size of it, the creation of evidence goes far beyond academia. Arron mentioned the C40 Climate Leadership Group. It's one of the groups that we've been working on for quite some time together. It produces data, but there are more than 300 city networks today. There's 80 new networks since 2000. 60% of city networks globally produce original research. This is to say that data is being produced by cities themselves and interpreted by cities themselves. And that's not even starting with the fact that then the private sector produces extensive amount of data as well. So in a sense, there's a need for greater experimentation there. One thing I'm going to leave it with is all of this is happening at the global level, and that's partly where we started with the International Expert Panel. There's been a reform, and there is a clear reform of the whole casing of the United Nations, global urban governance, if you wish. So numerous bits of the United Nations now are rethinking their relationship with cities. And right now, at this very moment, at the high-level political forum in New York, the discussion is in fact exactly on tracking and grasping what is the state of sustainability in cities according to SDG 11. So in a sense, the risk is always that we make this just a city story, that we forget that 4 kilometers down the road there is a reservoir of expertise, and that dialogue is fundamental, not just at the city level, but on a global scale. Stay tuned. By October, we'll give you a report on this.
Thank you very much. I'd like to very briefly pick up a couple of points of all the presentations and allow all the panelists to share some thoughts, like 2 minutes each, and then open up to the floor for questions. So you covered a lot of ground, and obviously I can't summarize everything, but it looks like context matters for urban problems, and we need to look more at the South. We need to draw knowledge from the South. We need to understand that cities are different. The other thing, picking on what you said, Arron, is that research, the turnaround of research is important. You need it fast to act on it. We need a system approach, so we need interdisciplinarity that poses other challenges, bringing different experts together to agree, as Michele also pointed out. So how are we going to do this? It looks like at the core of this there is co-production. Each one of us has mentioned that. So I wonder whether you could share, your views on what the real challenges, the practical challenges of doing this co-production to address all of those issues are. 2 minutes each.
Okay. Hello? Yep. Is that working? Okay. Very quietly, is it? I'm not used to being quiet. I was always told to be quiet, but that's why I'm a politician, I guess. So I'll add into that the multidisciplinary aspect of research. So a lot of city problems are holistic by nature. So it's great to get a piece of research which is focused on a quite specific issue or topic. But then the ability to connect the dots between different pieces of data, and I think Bernard's president. I think there's room for machine learning where the data is able to be machine learned, if you like, to try and cut through some of the noise. So I would say probably the biggest issue for a policymaker, and even at an implementation level, and when we talk about these fantastic city-to-city networks, they are amazing. Like, we get a lot of value from them. But it also is quite surprising how often you say, oh, I really wish there was a case study on this. And there is. And you know what? It was presented at a conference 2 weeks ago. So that ability to cut through a large amount of noise, the fact that you just kind of think, okay, this direction is right, and then someone who has a vested interest sponsors a piece of research which tells you, no, that's not the right direction. So cutting through that noise and having trusted, high integrity, independent, peer-reviewed bodies which are telling you this stacks up, and kind of getting to that stage where there's an understood layman's way of understanding in amongst cities what is this tick of approval that is required to tell me that this research is right, it's balanced, it's been peer-reviewed, and it's not just some private company who wants to kind of sell you some more product.
I guess there are many different challenges. Like the time scale is different, and we all have our sort of day jobs, which is different. So taking the time and sitting together and try to do something is basically out of our daily routine, daily jobs. But it is really important that we, I guess, to step out of our innovate comfort zone and then try to look at the problem and do something about it. So I thought probably I'll share with you some of my personal experience. Right after my PhD, actually, one of my first job was at a research institute in Japan, and we took on a project to try to regenerate the vegetation in a mining site in a city in China. And the mission is that we will take the approach that are really proven to be successful in Japan in more than 1,400 different sites, and then try to implement that in China. But that was the first time. And then we were, I was, young, and right after PhD, I was very confident. I said, what there is to argue about? This is a great thing. It will be delivering lots of ecosystem service and everything. But then, bang, we hit, the wall. And the local was saying, what? Native vegetation? Why would you do that? It's not even beautiful. And what's the use of, planting trees that you can find everywhere around here? And you're trying to explain, this is about regenerating the native, forest, and this is when, so and so, why this is so important to do so. But they just couldn't get around to the idea of, why this is important. And they were also really concerned about, how am I going to support the workers who are needed to take care of the, experiment site for the initial 2 or 3 years. I mean, it's out-of-pocket money for us, and then I cannot justify planting the native trees, and it's not even beautiful, right? So eventually, through several rounds of, co-production, co-designing, and then, try to workshop around this, and then we arrived into a solution saying, okay, why don't we just surround this this piece of native forest with fruit trees? So we grow fruit trees outside ring, and then those fruit trees, they will be providing fruit, and then they will be, providing some income stream to support those people who will be taking care of that piece of, revegetated land. So eventually, that's how the project become successful. So what is important, I guess, here is that each one of us need to be ready to step out of our comfort zone and then learn to, to be adaptable, to be flexible, and then innovate to, improvise according to the context. So.
Cool. The question of context matter is always an interesting one for me because then it depends on which scale of the context matters as well. And if you take, we've done some work a couple of years back on waste management and recycling in Sydney, and it got really bogged down into various specifics of neighborhood action and so forth. But at the end of the day, the waste industry is a $133 billion industry a year. It moves millions of tons between continents. Bits of the Sydney Morning Herald make it into China to be recycled, to be reprinted in Sydney. So in a sense there, the context matters, but there are multiple scales of the context. And that Jenny Robinson, University College London says, you cannot think of cities not thinking about each other. We live in a world, cities live in a world of cities. That you naturally relate to each other, and not just to your neighbors, to sort of international contexts. The question of the fast turnaround, I like it, because at the end of the day, there's been for a little too long an appreciation in academia, and I say this with care, but there's an appreciation that consultancy is a bad thing, and the co-production sways the quality of fundamental research, which is true and not. You can ask questions together. So for instance, in Melbourne at the moment, we're doing a piece of work with students and with researchers on nighttime governance and the governance of the nighttime. We've rarely paid attention to what happens after hours. It's a fundamental story, and yet that question we've asked not just because we were interested, but because a company called Arup is also interested in digging further with that. So you can ask important questions together rather than sort of just academically. And I think one of the biggest challenges I find with that is the question of funding. Most of the academic funding remains, and this is out of the panel, national, hence aligned to national priorities, hence aligned to national definitions of what disciplines are. And going back to Australia, I had to relearn entirely the whole classification of numbers that classify me as a lawyer rather than a planner than something else. And the fact that beyond that, the bulk of the funding is philanthropic. And the OECD says of the last 2 years, the 20 billion of funding that went into international development, 91% was earmarked, 48% was oriented towards global international programs. So it wasn't caring for specific local needs, and it had really specific conditions attached. And that's basically where the money is. It can be good or bad, great examples of Bloomberg and Ford Foundation and so forth. But where is the money and what conditions are attached to the money?
Thank you very much. We have a few minutes left, and we would like to hear from you, from the audience, if there are questions. And please identify yourself.
Hi, I have a question for all the three panelists, and that's the mode, how do you actually implement? Because we talk a lot about the science, but how do you actually translate from science to policy to implementation? So that's the thing. And I would like to actually suggest a possible solution that we have I think we've got it in Singapore. For example, the National Parks Board, we do have people who are scientists who then are able to actually identify the problems, craft it into question, work with the scientists and citizen scientists, craft the problem, come up with the results, translate the results into policy, and then get it implemented by end parts. So we need a channel for implementation. But I would like to actually ask the panelists, what do you see as the most important part to translate from results, policy, to implementation? Thanks. And the other point is that I think Singapore resonates very well with Melbourne in a lot of the things you do. Great.
Okay, I'll take the first question. I agree with you about the path from science to policy to implementation. There are so many good ideas and great pieces of research that are sitting on shelves. So I have a lot of admiration for people who can get the network, have the perseverance, the application, the dedication, and have the sales skills, frankly. We need to all be good marketers, even if we're in a lab, to take that through from a question to delivery. And when it happens, it's fantastic. So I'll go back to the urban forest strategy, and probably it's a little bit of the hair on fire stuff, because we'd like to think that we're sitting there and planning objectively and with great long timelines, but the urban forest strategy came in a time of crisis. So what happened was the Millennium Drought started effectively in 1999. And for the first couple of years, people went, oh, it'll be fine, it's just Australia, we have a drought, and then it starts raining again. And then, of course, it kept on going, and it kept on going, and it kept on going. So the urban forest strategy really only began in about sort of 2006, after we'd been through nearly 5 or 6 years of drought. And what that gave the kind of science to policy to implementation was a sense of urgency. It gave it budget, and it gave it a heck of a lot of people sitting around the table from all the various levels of decision makers to funders. So I think in some respects, it's how do we get that sense of urgency around the question we are asking? Is the question we're asking the right question? And when you talk about citizen science, I think it's a really important sort of perspective you're bringing, because how often do we actually say, what is the question that you want answered? So when we go out to our citizen scientists and ask them, what are the research areas or what are the questions, the burning questions you want answered, it's very different to us sitting around a room and trying to dream up what we think is the answer. So I think there's a bit of social science that we need to inject in all of these sciences, including environmental science, because it's amazing how often, you know, even infrastructure questions come back to being about people. And I think climate science is firmly about people again. So it takes a lot of different disciplines, I think, to get you from a question to policy to implementation. It takes a sense of urgency, whether that's manufactured or real, and it does take real and genuine funding. And it also takes someone who's a bit bloody minded. It takes someone who just keeps on pushing and keeps on pushing.
I think in a way, in your question, you already answered your question. For example, like we're talking about translating science into policy. But then I think the mode is in a way shifting, try to promote the way of, you know, co-designing the question from the very beginning together with the practitioner. In this way, you know, the city government or policymakers, they have an ownership in the research itself, rather than scientists coming in saying, oh, okay, here is a great finding, why don't you, you know, do something about it? So it is really important that the questions are co-designed, and then during the process also try to, you know, co-produce the knowledge and then co-own the you know, whatever the outcome is. But that doesn't really address, you know, the huge amount of urban science that are sitting there that can be actually translated. So this is a very complex sort of challenge, but one of the things that myself and some of my colleagues are trying to say is that from the city side, probably it is in time and it is important to have some sort of chief scientist, chief officer, science officer kind of role, so that that person can play a sort of linkage between the scientific community and then the policymakers. So for example, for me, if I want to approach a city, very often I don't know whom to contact. So if you do have a, you know, chief science officer, then it is very clear, okay, I can talk to that person, and then, you know, that can give me access to the policymakers, to the other, you know, practitioners. So that's one of the, you know, quite practical kind of suggestion. Why don't, you know, all the cities that actually, you know, above a certain, I guess, size and can afford this, try to, you know, introduce this post of chief officer, science officer.
Yeah, I'd echo all of that, that co-produced science is translated already to begin with. And the idea of a chief scientific officer in local government is crucial, but an idea of sort of getting local government engaged in science, in asking the questions, definitely. Not all local governments are like Melbourne or Sydney that are willing to play. Singapore, clearly one of the best examples globally. I'm a bit partial as a part NUS graduate, but clearly one of the best examples of really senior scientists also being fairly senior or really senior government people. And I mean, we have an example at the end of the day with the conversation with Chang and Chi, but there's numerous people, and in fact lots of women, that you can name in Singapore acting with that role. So I think another point on that is opening up the possibility for the scientists to wear a policy hat and for the policymakers to wear a scientific hat.
Hi, it's Nick Campbell from Nature Research. So a recurring theme in the panel's discussions was data, and that really seems to be the nub of a lot of the interaction between policy and the academic side. And we heard from Arron about that the City of Melbourne has an open data policy and releases many data sets. But I'm interested in the flow of data the other way and the culture in research about open data. So is this a community that really embraces open data as a principle, and I mean sharing data at early stages and not sitting data on an academic shelf somewhere that doesn't get shared with practitioners? Because it's both about implementation on the practitioner side, but if the data is not being provided to the practitioners and they don't understand the context of it, it's not going to change practice, right?
Do you want, we have 5 minutes. Yep.
Yeah, I think this open data thing still have very, very, very long way to go, because if you spend lots of time collecting your data, usually the first instance of research will be, let me make sense of this and then let me publish at least one paper before I share this data. So that's the kind of practice. But there are new kind of initiatives that try to recognize data as scientific product in itself. I think Nature has this data, sort of journal. So I think in that way, it is shifting a bit further, try to recognize data collection as in itself as kind of scientific product. But I agree there is a long, 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 long way to go, and this is one of the really crucial steps that we have to take. Just openly share data, and that will enable us to build comparative studies, to build more global sort of data set. But all this has to be done, I guess, future task.
Hi, my name is Ankit Bhardwaj. I'm a researcher at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi. And so I commend the panel's focus on the global south. That was quite refreshing. A question I have is less about data, and it's more about perhaps low capacity in sustainability concepts in the global south, right? So when I work with small to medium cities, they have immense knowledge and kind of tactile ability to do their own incentives, whatever that, build housing or toilets, etc. But concepts about sustainability tend to be quite complex for them. They're intersecting across different systems, et cetera, et cetera. So what is the challenges of communicating, what are the complex sciences of sustainability to decision makers with less capacity than perhaps those in the global north? Thank you.
What a great question. I'm so glad you asked this question in the last few minutes of our session. And I think my fellow panelists have really highlighted that focus on the global north. And one of the things that interests me every time that I go to a conference and they talk about, soon 50 or 60% of people will live in urban areas. Australia's at close to 90% already. So, and 80% of people in City of Melbourne live in apartments. So there's not a lot of transferable sort of sustainability research around 90% living in urban areas and 80% living in apartments. So that's one point I'll make. But the base level understanding is a critical one, and I've spent the last 20 years of my life doing this with my other hat on, and I call that my job that pays the bills. I started a social enterprise 20 years ago called Kids Teaching Kids. We work with about 500 schools across Australia and New Zealand and in South Korea. And the whole premise of that was that when I was in school, I was really passionate about the natural environment because I grew up on the beautiful Murray River, and I couldn't understand why everyone just didn't know how we are actually one and the same thing, and we're all part of the same system, and a real sense of place comes from being out there in the natural environment. And if it's diminished, we're diminished as well. It just seems like a fundamental thing to me. So I set about, with Kids Teaching Kids, implementing a program in elementary and secondary school to get that base level understanding. But most importantly, it probably comes back to this question over here, is how do you motivate people? And you don't care about what their motivation is. It could be, I want to save money on my power bills. It could be anything. How do you motivate people to want to understand and know more about these natural processes that you need to know about the basics of climate science? So that is, I think, the critical question, that it needs to start, they say, from early childhood. And that's why we've got to do more as a research community, as policymakers, to resist this kind of push. It's happening in Australia in some of our states where they want to remove climate science from the curriculum. And so we should be absolutely standing up in arms about that, because that is an indictment on our education system. It is ideology creeping in where science should be well and truly firmly planted in. And what it does is it actually removes the opportunity for our kids to participate in the jobs of now and tomorrow. So even aside from the fact that we all need a clean air to drink and clean air to breathe and fresh water to drink, aside from that, these are the jobs that our kids should be being prepared for. So It's a long-winded answer, but I've actually got a lot of material on Kids Teaching Kids, you're welcome to, that my whole life has been about how do I get others to have that same base level understanding, because I think in a policy sense, in an implementation sense, we could move so much more quickly if we were having conversations coming from that base level understanding. So it's a great question.
Thank you very much for the questions, and hold the ones you couldn't ask for later in the break. Yeah, so very quickly, just like half a minute each, what is your takeaway today?
Half a minute. I'll be quicker. I think that I'm so excited every time the scientific community, policymakers and implementers come together in true partnership, because great things happen. And I think if you're making decisions in the absence of science and good data, you're probably on a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, I share that. I mean, this is a great time in a way to work in this urban science and urban practice as well. So I guess we just have to, make the best of it, and then try to work together, and then try to generate some of the cutting edge, but also actionable sort of urban knowledge.
Yeah, uncharacteristically for an academic, that we're actually quite positive. It's quite an exciting, it's quite a good time. And there's changes both at the global and at the local level that are really worth acknowledging and engaging with. I'd encourage everyone to sort of get engaged, because it's a good moment to be listened to and to make a difference, in a sense.
Thank you very much, everybody. It was an exciting session. Thank you.